What are some of the ways then we can get to a point where we have that level of trust in our relationships, but I guess more importantly within ourselves to allow someone to soothe us that way?
Hmm. You know, it's it's a philosophical question, right? Because can someone soothe us? That's the first question. Or do we first, the first line of attention needs to be how do we soothe ourselves? And how do we have the conversation with ourselves first? Because if we can have that conversation with ourselves, I don't care if you're, where you are, in your makeup, or who you are, whoever is listening today, it's how do you soothe yourself? And if you're soothing yourself through mm, perhaps more unhealthy choices, then those unhealthy choices, and I don't have to label them. You all know what they are, right? Um, and they're going to be different again for everyone. Then you're not really being present with the self. You're just creating an immunity to yourself. So, how do you stay awake and self soothe? And I talk about breath, I talk about exercise, I talk about eating well, I talk about mm, having friends and having community and being very aware that if those friends don't feel like friends, sometimes you got to let them go so that you can go on your next adventure, because we are always changing and evolving, and those friendships are always changing and evolving. I've got friends that I've had since junior high, and I mean, oh my God, they're amazing and they know me really, really well. And there have been moments in our lives where there's needed to be a hiatus, and then we come back together again and we do a dance. So, but do I trust that person? Yeah, with my life, and sometimes I think it sounds kind of crazy, but sometimes, and I wonder if you ever think this, if I were dying, who would I want to be by my side?
Beautiful question. I know exactly who I would want there. It's interesting you say that. I know who I would want there, and I know who I wouldn't want there. And some of those people that I wouldn't want there are actually still in my life.
So it's an interesting thought, isn't it? That they're good enough, and that's okay because not everybody can show up for us in the way that we need, right? Or want. Um, and a lot of people can't really, um, they can't manage when someone is grieving or is in pain.
I agree. I agree. I had someone in the last 4 years, I had two people pass away. So I had to grieve in different ways. One was a friend that was very inspired by me, and another person was someone that raised me. The
Mhm.
friend was probably about 4 years ago. The person who raised me was last year. Um, and the grieving was different because at the time I was in two different relationships,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
the first time that person grieved, the person kind of made it worse for me by their reaction. And the second time, same thing, but they made it worse for two different reasons. The first one was the support they offered wasn't the support that I needed, is the support that they would have accepted if it was them. I think a lot of people fall into that trap. And then
Mhm.
the second one was more like just unaware, right? Like
Mhm.
they didn't do anything bad, they didn't do anything good, they just didn't do anything. They're right in the middle, right?
Mhm.
So I ask you now, when it comes to the grieving process, whether because I know you mentioned like it could be sexual, it could be a passing of someone, it could be anything. What's maybe some myth or some of the myths that happens when someone is grieving that you want to dispel and say, okay, this isn't true?
Mhm. When we have people around us who are witnesses to a loss that we're going through, and let's just initially keep it simple. Not that anything about grief is simple, because there is nothing about grief that's simple. I want everyone to know it doesn't follow a path. It's not linear. It doesn't go from A to B to C. It doesn't follow the five stages, which were written brilliantly by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote and studied what people who were dying were going through. The five stages were not actually written for people who were living with the grief, with the losses. It was for the dying. So oftentimes the interpretation is you're going to get to closure, because in her last stage it was acceptance, which is kind of a way to say closure. Um, More and more people are writing about, thankfully, the fact that there isn't a closure. There isn't an acceptance. When I was 27 years old, I lost my partner, and he was much older than me. And we had 2 years of like being together, and the last year he was dying. And it was really hard to talk about it, to um, get support, because the people around me thought I should be doing it in a certain way, and I wasn't doing it that way. And so somehow I was wrong. And then, and there is no wrong. If we can, as a support system, find ways to help people understand that the way they're grieving is right for them. And that can look like a lot of different things. So, one of the things that we don't think about is who someone is, like their personality type, when they are affected by grief. So, if let's say you're an introvert or an extrovert or an ambivert, which is like a little bit in between, you may go through the grieving process and dance with it, partner with it in a very different way. Someone who's an introvert may never go to group therapy, may not reach out to a therapist or get into a chat room or go to their church or synagogue or mosque to get support. Maybe they'll talk to one friend. Maybe they'll do it on their own. They'll read books. They'll become a little more scholarly around grief and what they're experiencing, right? But the extrovert, the extrovert's going to go to a group and maybe go to therapy and then have a group of friends and they're hanging out. And the ambivert will do a little bit of both.